Dear guests and dear participants, I'm honored to present you the final panel of the Global Leadership Forum on its 21st year, Middle East Once More. In this panel, postdoctoral fellow at Lancaster University, Dr. Mustafa Menshawi, expert of Iraq studies at Orsam Watek Al-Sadoun, and ambassador of the Republic of Turkey to Baghdad, His Excellency Ali Reza Güney, will discuss the current state of affairs in the Middle East with the moderation of Ambassador Dr. Oğuz Çelikkol. I hope you all enjoy this discussion. Dear sirs, I will leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much. I think I should start a little bit making the why this meeting is going to be important, because Middle East passing to I think a changing time. I don't want to say difficult time, but probably a changing time. There are several things I can point out. Of course, first of all, there is a change in Qatari-Saudi relations. Hopefully, it will lead to more cooperation among the Gulf Cooperation Council states. We don't know what it will lead to. Secondly, of course, we see a new incoming or already started Biden administration policies in the Middle East. We see that President Biden is trying to distance himself from the Trump's 4 year of difficult times, U.S. difficult times in the Middle East, especially in the Palestinian issue, also probably in Iran, nuclear deal. There is indications that Biden administration would like to return back to Iran nuclear deal. Also, of course, there is incoming probably changing. It will affect the presidential elections in Iran. It will affect Iranian policy in the Gulf, in the Middle East probably, and in Iraq probably. There is going to be probably a change of president in Iraq. Instead of Rouhani, Javad Zarif policies, apparently we are going to see a more conservative president instead of what they call moderate Rouhani and Zarif dual policy. Rouhani is the president, of course, Javad Zarif is the foreign minister. That is, of course, something that probably we should be concentrating a little bit. What is going to happen when the president is going to change in Iran? How is it going to affect Iranian policies in Iraq and the Middle East, in the Gulf, even maybe in Syria? Also, another change probably is today I have learned that the possibility of Netanyahu prime ministership is going to end in Israel. Probably Labid, the head of the opposition party, is going to be able to form a new government, and that will end uninterrupted 12 years of Prime Minister Netanyahu's reign in Israel. That is probably going to change Israeli policies towards the Palestinians, maybe in Iran, and it was going to affect probably Turkish relations with Israel. So that is an important news. I think maybe we have to look a little bit what the prime ministership change in Israel is going to affect the policies in the Middle East. Because we know that Mr. Netanyahu was following very strict policies towards the Palestinians. But during the Netanyahu term, I was ambassador also in Tel Aviv for some time. Turkish-Israeli relation passed through difficult times also. So that is another important area probably we have to look during this conference. The other thing is Syria. The situation is continuing in Syria. Of course, the difficult situation in Syria is continuing. Syria is still divided, and half of the population and half of it is outside of the country. Almost 12 million people became homeless and refugees. Half of it in their own country, half of it in other countries. And recent presidential election on the 26th of May, I guess, is not going to help the situation because I was ambassador in Syria for 5 years. I know the country very well, but it is a very difficult situation. All our hopes were attached to Constitutional Committee, the success of the Constitutional Committee, and now we are going to see that President Assad arranging these elections. Assad family will continue another 7 years in Syria, and all the hopes attached to the Constitutional Committee's work is going to be waste. So maybe we should also look into the Syrian situation. And Syria is divided itself. The regime is controlling some part of Syria, but that division looks like is going to continue for some time. If there is no political solution to Syrian situation, that's going to be difficult. And we also see a new, I don't want to, name it a new Cold War in the Middle East, but apparently the Cold War already started in the Middle East between Russia and the United States. The United States is now present in the Middle East. US has almost 50,000 soldiers. All these military bases almost in all Arab countries of the Middle East. The Americans have a military base and station soldiers. And the Russians now have a military base and 2 military bases, one air base, one naval base in Syria. And according to the press reports, more than 4,000 Russian soldiers already stationed in Syria. So that is from a point of view, maybe returning back to the Cold War area. So all these subjects, probably more the Egyptian policy probably is attached to Saudi Arabia alliance against Qatar. All these incidents make the things and situation in the Middle East a little bit more precarious to understand. So we are going to concentrate on all these subjects. I know we have, of course, our ambassador to Iraq. He will talk a little bit about probably Turkish foreign policy, not only towards Iraq, but also Middle East. And other distinguished speakers will talk about other issues in the Middle East. So I think we should give 20 minutes time for the presentation of each speakers, and then we will chat a little bit on the questions. Does it sound a good process for you? Okay, very good. 15-20 minutes presentation from each speakers. I think we should start maybe with the speaker, Mustafa Mansouri. to make his Dr. Mustafa Manshawi to make his presentation.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sheril Kol, and it's great meeting you all. And on a very happy note of you mentioned the changes that's happening in the Middle East, and the bit of pessimistic note about the Cold War is actually starting in one way or another. I think one of the key questions that we need to ask ourselves is how to move forward, how to improve the situation in order to find a more middle ground position in which all states can afford the pushing things forward, and in that case, de-escalate the situation. I think the first point that we have to put in mind is a sense of de-securitization, if I put it that way. That means actually where states are not seeing each other as threats or a sense of othering or just strategies of antagonism, if I put it as such. So countries coming together where they look for bilateral relations. And it's very interesting here, just as an Egyptian myself, to look at the Egyptian-Turkish relations as a prototype of how to move things forward. We just noticed from 2013 that the tension was in its high, where the two countries are exchanging a tirade of accusations between President Erdogan and President Sisi. The situation gets deteriorated with Libya involved, with East Mediterranean, and now we're seeing a sort of easing off of the tension in one way or another. And I see the one way of doing that is at two levels: the de-securitization level, where actually we find the rapprochement between Turkish officials and Egyptian officials exchanging niceties of how to move relations forward. And the second element, which is really important with the de-securitization at this narrative level, is the economic interests, pushing economic interests forward. I think that economic entanglement would keep that situation in the region more peaceful. And again, we can make reference to the Egyptian Turkish relations, where the two countries, even despite the tension that they had, actually the economic relation between the two countries didn't go down, which is giving a very solid ground for relations to move forward. So with that economic positioning between states, that in that case, we can see how the tension can go down. Still, kind of this optimistic vision that needs to come also with how to reposition the geopolitical interests of each country. I think that this economic togetherness would help, especially with the East Mediterranean as well. I think it's in the interests of a country like Egypt to have Turkey as part of the East Mediterranean. It's not this kind of exclusive policy which is happening right now, the encirclement, if you put it as such, where Egypt, Greece, and Cyprus, I mean the Greek-Cyprus part coming together, in which Turkey is not part of it. It's great if Turkey can be included into that. So the inclusiveness that comes via economic element and is really important. The second, or perhaps the third element in which we can help diffuse the tension is what we can call the discursive de-escalation. Most of the tension that comes across in the region is discursive in the sense of statements coming from each part, which is keeping the tension high. I believe that this change of the rhetoric, of the discourse, is really important. We keep seeing how the Gulf crisis is discursively heightened and actually being escalated as such, where Arab states are calling each other names like dogs when they refer to the Qatari statements to critics on the Gulf crisis, and the response coming from the Saudis and Egyptians as high as it could be. Perhaps the first step is actually the discursive escalation that come across. And I'm very pleased that is happening as well if we refer to the Egyptian-Turkish case, where statements coming from both sides as different as it could be. So all these elements coming together as important as such, and I believe that they can contribute to a situation in which we can see elements coming together. My final point, which is very interesting, I think that the region of the Middle East, and perhaps Mr. Al-Sadoun and Ambassador Gunay would talk about that, is the failure to accommodate ideology and geopolitics. Until now, I see that different states are struggling between how reconcile their ideological position and the interests that comes very realistically as such, as the case, for example, of Turkey's AKP with its political Islamist lineage coming in the way when it comes to the opposite case of the Saudi-Egyptian alliance, for example, in which they take the political Islam as a threat. I think that the states need to find a middle ground position in which they can reconstruct this kind of accommodation between ideology and the geopolitics. I'm not quite sure how this is can be done on the ground, but what I'm sure is that there are different ways of helping that. And perhaps this failure to accommodate ideology and geopolitics are causing the part of the problems we can see in Iraq, we can see in Egypt as well, we can see in the Gulf region. And to be more specific and practically, one key element that we can ask ourselves how to deal with the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, which is the strongest and the biggest opposition force in the Middle East. Should we exclude the Brotherhood away from the geopolitical position? And in that case, we ask ourselves a number of questions. How that can be done? We have thousands of members of the Brotherhood in Turkey, for example. How can we deal with that issue? At the same time, the Egyptian rhetoric that is coming as legitimating as such is depending on this kind of antithetical position to the Muslim Brotherhood. So how can we reconcile the two countries? And on the second element of ideological, the second pivot of ideological interest dichotomy we find in Iraq, the Sunni Shia axis, that is the binarism that is happening up there, and all the the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, which is extended or drawn in it. How can we de-escalate this kind of situation? Things are getting harder, especially if we link it to what's happening in the 7th century feud, the blood feud, which is as perennial, as established, as fixated as such. So how can we move forward from this Sunni Shia tension that is coming across ideologically, fixating the issue that's really happening into the geopolitical interest-based issue in order to move forward and look at interests as shared, as bilateral, as reconciliatory as they could be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we should leave the question and answer period to the end after two distinguished speakers make their presentation. So, Mr. Al-Sadoun, can I invite you to make your presentation, please?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And also I thank Bahçeşehir University for this invitation. Mr. Chairman, I would like to talk about the Iraqi arena. Now we have a new dynamic in Iraq. There are three important historical joints or events in the last 5 years. They are who rated and drive the new dynamics in Iraq. We can say there is overlap between these historical joints. The first historical joint is the outcome of the war against ISIS, which began in June 2014. This war created a new equation of the power and influence in the Iraqi arena. The armed vacation supported by Iran, whether inside or outside the popular mobilization forces, have become the most influential party in the Iraqi arena. And they have a great ability to control the political and security decision in Iraq. Your Excellency, from 2003 until the emergence of ISIS in 2014, the armed vacations were moving in the Iraqi arena under the cover and protection of the political parties. And most of these vacations were armed wings with limited role from the political parties with influential role. But after the war on ISIS or against ISIS, the equation of power and influence in the Iraqi arena changed. And political figures and parties began to move under the protection and cover of the armed vacation. And the influential political parties became like political wings with limited role from armed vacation. With a strong and the armed vacation became strong and influential, have influential role. The second historical joint is the withdrawal of the United States from the 5+1 deal on the Iranian nuclear issue in June 2018. And the policy of the maximum pressure on Iran that was adopted by former United States President Trump. This historical joint turned Iraq into the main battlefield for the conflict between United States and Iran. And the tools of this conflict that Iran used in Iraq are the Iraqi armed vacation. The third historical joint is the mass protest that began in October 2019. These protests have shaken the political and security and social situations in Iraq. And before these protests, the conflicts, crises, and divisions in Iraq were sectarian in nature. But after these protests, the conflict and division in Iraq became between those who aim to change the situation against those who resist this change. These interactions produced at present time a struggle between three wills or three trends in the Iraqi arena. The first trend that aims to make radical change in the situation, which includes change all the conditions and rules of the political process in post-2003. Also, it aims to displace all the traditional political class from the political scene in Iraq. Those who belong to this third are the protest movements and their supporters from the Iraqi people, and their supporters are in the millions. But they are until now the weakest party in the Iraqi street in terms of security. but they are the most popular. The second trend that aims to keep the situation as it, like status quo, and continue the conditions and rules of the political process, and continue sharing power and its gains, and not allow to any change that threatens its gains. Those who belong to this trend are the political armed parties and their supporters. They are the most powerful party in the Iraqi street in the terms of security. The third trend are those who aim to make limited, non-radical change in the political, security, and economic situation. Change that reduce the anger of the Iraqi street and at the same time protect the continuance of the political process and ensure the remain of the traditional political parties in the political scene. Those who belong to this trend are the leaders from the moderate political class and the in the social and religious forces. Also, there is some religious forces support this choice in the Iraq. This party is capable of producing a new political programs or projects. Well, also there is an important development in Iraqi arena. That's the election, the upcoming election. Well, we know, all know, regular elections are supposed to hold in the spring of 2022. But the protest of October 2019 and the events that followed these protests created a great public pressure on the political parties and forces that shared power in Iraq to after 2003. Those protests imposed on parties to keep holding early elections. When we talk about early election, we know the talk about the early election began in early 2020. The political and media lights and even the attention of Iraqi street focused on the following issues: the issue of a new electoral law, the formation of a new electoral commission, and complete the formation of the federal court, which will ratify the election results. Now, after completing all these steps, we can say that the political and media interest and the attention of the Iraqi street is focused at the present time on the following issues: the election date and electoral coalitions and election security and integrity. These elections are not really early anymore, as they have been postponed from the date that Prime Minister Mustafa Al-Kadhimi officially announced, which was June 6 at 2021, to a new date proposed by the Election Commission to Prime Minister Al-Kadhimi, and Al-Kadhimi officially approved and announced it, which is 10 at next October. There is even October date, it may be postponed to a regular at spring 2022. As for the change that may happen in the upcoming election, according to the current conditions, no major change are accepted. We just, all the observers accepted limited change, like maybe happened a change in the number of the parliamentary seats for the traditional political forces, an increase for some and a decrease for some, but it will remain present in the political scene. Also, maybe some new political movements obtain a very limited and ineffective number of electoral seats. These new political movements are of, and there is two types of new political movements. The first type is a political movement that claims to be independent and new, but in reality, it's just a new branch of the traditional political forces. The second type of the new political movement is a new political movement claim to be close to the October protest, but are in the fact supported by the traditional political forces. We have a new political movement really represent the October protest. But the traditional political forces will do everything to prevent this movement from reaching the Iraqi parliament. The third important development in Iraq, or third important issue in Iraq, is the United States-Iranian conflict in the Iraqi arena. Well, we often hear of officials from United States accusing Iran of turning Iraq into the main battlefield with the United States. But I think that the two parties, the United States and Iran, prefer that Iraq be the main arena for the struggle between them for many reasons. The first reason, there are several fronts in the region between United States and Iran. But like the Gulf states, like the Arabian Sea and Iraq. But Iraq is the most fragile and chaotic among those fronts. Therefore, the Iraqi arena gives more flexibility to the two parties to carry out political and security maneuvers in Iraq. The second issue, the second reason why Iraq chosen as main battlefield between United States and Iran is because the sovereignty in Iraq has a great flexibility and multiple interpretations. And this comforts the two sides, United States and Iran, because of this flexibility and the sovereignty. As for the future of the conflict between United States and Iran in the Iraqi arena, the United States has invested a lot in Iraq, and cannot implement a complete and real withdrawal from Iraq as it did in Afghanistan. Because of United States withdraw, if United States withdraws from Iraq, this will be a great victory for Iran, and Iran will work to push United States to withdraw from all the region, not just in Iraq. The second reason, Iran got many historical gains in Iraq after 2003, and it cannot give up its gains in Iraq easily. According to these facts, in the short term, Iraq will remain an arena of conflict, and on the other hand, for bargaining between United States and Iran. I will stop here, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, Ambassador Güney, may I invite you to make your presentation, please?
Thank you, His Excellency Çelikbol. Actually, I'm planning to zoom out a little bit instead of dealing with particulars and the specifics of the bilateral relations of the countries in the region. I would just emphasize a couple of points that I have distilled throughout my diplomatic career, and partly you have, witnessed my diplomatic career when you were in Israel. I was in your team. I worked in Egypt as a chargé between 2015 and 17, and I was the Deputy Director General of Iraq for the last 3.5 years. And now I'm trying to explore Iraq on the ground, which is almost an impossible task to fulfill. But let's zoom out a little bit. And I have just have a couple of points that I would like to share with you. The title of this session is Middle East Again, as if Middle East has fallen back of the agenda for a while, and then it is again at the top of the agenda. I humbly disagree with it. Middle East, I think always would be the better title, because not only in the recent past, since the discovery of oil, but since the ancient times, Middle has topped the agenda of international relations. And definitely things happen in the Middle East, affect all over the world. A direct impact on global politics, international relations. Yes, it is a subsystem of the international system of relations among the nations, but it is such a subsystem that has a domino effect on each and every other subsystems. This was the first point that I would like to emphasize. And the second thing is today's Middle East, whichever country we are talking about, Iran, Iraq, Qatar, Saudi, different than that of 20 or 30 years ago. Thanks to the information, communication technology, people are more intertwined with each other. As the academics call it, the world has turned to be a global village, and Middle East surely so. What makes the Middle East different from the other regions is demography, and demography matters. The youth became a decisive actor in the Middle East politics. High rates of the population growth, simply because I served in Egypt and Iraq, that was quite visible. Youth in the streets, and they are no more static. Like 30 years ago or 40 years ago, they are no more static. There are no more objects. They are striving to be subjects of the political issues, and they are very, very dynamic. They are interconnected, and they have aspirations. You cannot stop them to have their aspirations to be fulfilled. They have expectations. They have needs. Simply because they're interconnected with each other, they can easily see and observe what is going on in the neighboring country, or in Europe, or in the States, or in Far East, just in a blink of an eye. So the thing is, the question at hand in the Middle East politics is whether or not the regimes are capable to address their needs. And since the Arab Spring, I think we have many test cases, I would say, in taken different directions, came out with different outcomes. So that is one of the determinant factor in today's Middle East politics, youth. The reasons that those Arab Spring youth came to the scene are still there. the essential root causes are still there and not have been yet addressed properly. So since I'm in Iraq, I actually observed the same story here since October 2019. As Professor As-Sadoun rightly remarked, these young people are in the streets. And unfortunately, in each and every case, as it happened also in Egyptian case or in other Arab Spring laboratory cases, I would say, all these kind of popular movements after a while are being hijacked. By not addressing them properly, they fall in the trap of being hijacked by some radical groups. And then the story changes. The story changes. It changes to a story of the radicals or extremists versus the regime. Let me get to the third point I would like to emphasize, and it's much more academic than from a diplomatic point of view. I would definitely underline the word empathizing. I think empathizing is the key concept to, not necessarily sympathizing, by the way, empathizing itself, to understand the other's concerns. And this is the very basic pillar of trust building. You have to understand the other's concerns, the other's threat perceptions, the other's history, the other's traumas, to start talking in a constructive manner. In other words, unless you internalize the concerns of the other side, you cannot come out from that conversation with a win-win. You have to sit, at least mentally, not across the table, but on the same side of the table, showing each other that we are on the same page, and let's start talking, because everything starts with talking, and then try to understand, try to empathize. And history, I guess, is the key word here, and I would refer to the famous sentence or saying of Bernard Louis. He says, when you refer to history in the West, in the States, let's say, when you say this is history, it means it's in the garbage bin. But when you come to the Middle East and it says it is history, it means a colossal background. And this colossal background shapes the mindset of the people, the mindset of the Egyptians, the mindset of the Iraqis, the mindset of the Turks. Each of us around this conversation have our own traumas. When you refer to Sèvres Treaty back in the aftermath of the First World War, it raises some myths or concerns in Turkey. When you refer to Muslim Brotherhood, you touch a nerve in the Egyptian leadership. And same in Iraq. Mr. As-Sadoun referred to Shia, Sunni, coming from the Saddam years. So let's empathize each other and then try to find a constructive approach for a win-win solution. That is, I think, a must for trust building. And it requires, of course, as you know very well, the strategic communication with each other. And the fourth and last part is the Turkish foreign policy, how we would define Turkish foreign policy in all the developments around Turkey. And I always refer to the same talking points, and it works. And I will do the same here. Maybe Ambassador Çelikol is very familiar with these talking points, but when we say these, we mean it. And now you will see that we also need it badly. Stability, security, and prosperity in the Middle East. These are very nice cardinal principles used by everybody when delegations come together, each party respects these notions for the other party, but it doesn't work so usually. But when it comes to Turkey, we need those principles simply because our development model in Turkey, our growth model, depends on these principles. We don't have oil as Iraq does. We don't have natural gas as Iraq both and Egypt does. What we do have is human resource. And all this development story, a success story actually from 2000s, basically depends on this human resource. We mobilized our human potential. We built the infrastructure. We have this youth. I think the average age is 29, but climbing. And same story for Iraq and Egypt. 70% of the population is below 30 in these two countries. And in other countries, the Middle East has the biggest youth population. So by being deprived of these natural resources, we had to depend on our human potential. And what we have to export to other countries is commodities that we produce. Yes, by importing some raw materials, or I would say medium commodities that we can produce the commodity itself and then export it to the Middle East. It's a great market, a consumer market, a huge population. So for this model to work, we need the arteries to be open. If those arteries are closed, as half of it closed now because of Syria, it leads to cardiac arrest. So we need stability. We need security, and we need prosperity. This all brings about Turkey's growth model. His Excellency Çelikol, I would stop here, not going into details of Turkey's foreign policy towards Iraq or Egypt or any other country, but if you have questions, I'm happy to answer anytime.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. We have almost 40 minutes, so we will discuss a little bit about the things you have already mentioned. I agree that, of course, the Middle East is a subsystem within the international system, but as you pointed out, it has its own dynamics, and of course, demography instability is one of the characteristics becoming in the region. So maybe for a discussion now, we talk a little bit about, since we talk about the demography, the young generations, in the population, we can talk a little bit about the Arab Spring, since we have two Arab speakers among us. Maybe I can ask them a little bit about what they think about the Arab Spring, why it failed, or if it failed, and maybe we can talk a little bit about Ambassador Güney talk about Turkey's interest in the stability of the Middle East because of its economy needs. The stability. We can talk a little bit Turkey's economic interest in the Middle East. This is, of course, related to also Turkish-Egyptian relations. What's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean? Ambassador Güney pointed out we need natural gas, and Iraq has oil and natural gas. Egypt has, we are already buying probably large quantity of liquid gas from Qatar, but we want to lessen our dependency Russia and the other sources, we can talk a little bit about Turkish economic interest in the Middle East. Mr. Sadun and Mr. Mansiski, may I ask your opinions about the Arab Springs and Ambassador Güney's opinion a little bit more in detail, Turkish interest in the Middle East, with the Middle Eastern countries and in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Well, actually, in Iraq, maybe the protests in Iraq not classify as a part of the Arab Spring.
Yes, I'm sorry. Can you probably, if you are talking about Iraq, can you enlighten us a little bit about the unrest in the south?
Yes, I'm going to. Yes.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about generally Arab Spring in the Middle East.
Well, in general, Mr. Chairman, also the protests in Iraq, they are similar in the conditions and similar in the income of the Arab Spring. I think the Arab Spring and the Iraqi protest shaking the system of the region, the political system and the social system in the region. And Mr. Ambassador Ali Reza Gonai mentioned for the factors that behind this protest and behind all this movement. And he mentioned for the dilemma of the new Arabic generation. Well, all the crises and conflict in the region, also the demands of the Arab youth that participate in the Arab Spring or participate in the Iraqi protest should be solved. And the region, our region, can no longer be more complex. The economic conditions of the region are in great danger. Also, the development and the service, the health and the education conditions of the people of the region are in decline. Therefore, the conflicting parties must go to dialogue, and since of the their people. Also, foreign parties must also be prevented from tempering many conflicts and many suffering in this region because of the foreign intervention in our region. This is what I to say about the context in the context of Arab sovereignty. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. What is your views, Mr. Manshawi, about the Arab Spring and Turkish interest in the Middle East?
Thanks, Ambassador Shelly-Cole, and it's a great. I'll make reference to 3 key points. I'm sure that if I want to answer the question on Arab Spring, I need 24 hours, which we didn't have the time, all of us, definitely. So the 3 key points that I want to make reference to, the first one is that if we look at the Arab Spring as an end game, the outcome, it's a failure. If we look at the Arab Spring as a process in which it's still evolving and we're still witnessing a different turn points, just that means actually in the middle of it, so it's hard to judge it. Perhaps we could have mixed answers as such. So this is the first answer. So it's really too early to argue whether it's failure or not. And because Professor Gunai made reference to history, if we look at the history of the revolutions, we look at the anatomy of classical revolution, the English Revolution in the 15th century, the French Revolution in the 18th century, and even the American revolutions before that, we see the process of moving from one stage to another. So perhaps we have to be very patient. The three manifestations that are clear out of the Arab Spring for me, I'll take it from what Professor Gunay mentioned, what Mr. Al-Sadou mentioned, is the power of people. We are actually witnessing a very unique moment of moving from top-down politics, which state actors are the most important. The state is the center of contention, into a horizontal prefigurative politics in which people, individuals, the person are the most important. Actually, what I would argue for is that the Arab Spring were moved were individuals in the street, even until now the dictatorships which are still remaining are in one way or another are the result of a sense of public satisfaction. I think Professor Gunay was in Cairo. He can see this sense of satisfaction that is growing up, the pressure on the regime to move forward. So this sense of horizontalism, we keep people in mind. What we have in the Arab region is weak states and strong societies. The states are weak, but they're fierce because they have the use of force, the legitimate use of force, the army, the police as such. So perhaps this is really important. The third point which we have to consider, which is the importance of democracy. When we speak about people, actually Professor Gunay mentioned the three pillars of Turkish policy, which he mentions stability, security, and prosperity. And I think there is one pillar which is missing. Perhaps we can turn the triangle into a square. And this is really important where Turkey and Turkish foreign policy can help with, which is democracy. I think that democracies don't fight with each other. Professor Gunay mentioned the Bernard Lewis, who is actually a key Orientalist in arguing about history, inevitability, and determinism that come with history. I'll mention the liberal position where democracies don't fight with each other. So if we see more democracy in Turkey, we see more democracy in Egypt, we see more democracy in Iraq, security will be arrived and prosperity as well. And of course, we look at the European example as such. So I think that we need to improve this kind of sense of relationship between states and people in both countries. I'm not quite sure how this can be materialized, but I am sure that there is a way of articulating it, pushing it forward, because this element of looking at people as one element in the game as such, sadly, this vision of mine, as idealistic as it could be, is hampered by the reality on the ground, which is based on proxy wars in which states and non-state actors are predominant. Look at Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, in which we are represented, but different countries like Syria, Iran as well, which is really pessimistic in a way, because that means people are more suppressed. Freedom of expression, the media are not coming as strong as such. And finally, this leads us to the importance of strategic narratives, which is actually, I'm an expert in discourse analysis and discursive reality. Perhaps we need this kind of element in which strategic narratives need to change, in which people will have a final say. It's really sad because the talks now between Egypt and Turkey are focusing on media platforms, which is funded by Turkey on Turkish soil. And we are actually witnessing the Saudi-Qatar relations are being hampered or actually being tensed by the presence of Al Jazeera. And these are all ideological state apparatuses. We're not speaking about how people are represented. We're speaking about how states are using, manipulating, or overusing these narratives for their own strategic positions. Perhaps the first point that we put in mind, how people decide, opening this public space, pushing it forward for people to represent themselves as such. Thank you.
Ambassador Gunay, maybe you can a little bit more tell us what do you mean about the prosperity part of your three pillars and the Turkish economic interest in the Middle East?
There is a way to square this triangle, of course. Thank you.
I will get into the geometry, triangles and squares, but you know, diplomats are well known by talking too much and saying nothing. And I will take it to the other way and talk a little less and say a little something. I tried by drawing this triangle to emphasize the real motivations of Turkish foreign policy because of badly needing exports, and this export growth model is the only model, I guess, we can build our economy. And for this exports to be materialized, we need open arteries, transportation corridors to the Middle East and beyond. So security, stability, prosperity at one side and democracy on the other side, it's kind of a chicken and egg issue because as I observed in Egypt, when you go and talk to people in the street, was democracy topping their agenda? I doubt it. It was first, yes, democracy in a way of, freedom, dignity, equality, and then all of a sudden it turned to be security, not democracy anymore. And I guess for a long time it was so, because their very basic needs were threatened, and that was security. So democracy, I would assume, comes later, after laying the groundwork, which is security, very first step. Of course, Turkey's foreign policy has many challenges around, but specifically in the Middle East, I would say that some of our approaches to some countries have been misinterpreted. I wouldn't put the blame on their shoulders or on their lap. It might be a lack of strategic communication, like Iraq. And let me give you a solid example. We have been dealing this PKK terrorism for over 40 years, and we haven't convinced our Iraqi brothers, we call them brothers because of the Ottoman past, that this terrorist organization is a terrorist organization. They haven't labeled it as such, and they are still, turning a blind eye to our saga for the last 40 years. Finally, the Kurdish side, because PKK started hitting them, understood that PKK is an existential threat and a strategic threat for their own national security. And in Sinjar case, that Mr. Sadun might be following closely, they are also challenging and defying the sovereignty of Iraqi state. So Iraqi establishment, I would say, started questioning whether they can live together with this PKK or not. And everybody knows that PKK is flirting with some radical groups within Iraq. And this whole picture destabilizes Iraq. And while we are conducting operations trying to eradicate those PKK terrorists, all of a sudden, we face from the Iraqi side that they claim that Turkey is breaching their sovereignty. Now that's a tragic story that is lacking the strategic communication between the two countries. We are trying to eliminate this terrorist organization, which is undermining the sovereignty of Iraq. And Iraq is coming to us and telling us that you're breaching our sovereignty. You're violating our airspace. So this is a very tragic example of two countries neighboring each other for decades, not able to communicate wisely, constructively. And I hope in the coming years, we will be able to come and sit together and try to understand each other. So that is one issue that I would give an example for this session. And the second issue is the water, which is a famous label agenda item in our Turkish-Iraqi relations. Water has been a contentious point between Turkey and Iraq, and it's still so. But by the twist of fate, in 2018, we were building this famous dam that Iraqis were not happy with. And they were asking us to keeping open the floodgates or gates of the dam, because they said if you close the gates and start filling the dam, then we will be deprived of water. It is already a drought season, and etc. We said, our president actually, for 3 times, despite it was a hydro dam, which means the water should flow anyways to produce energy. Our president said, okay, if you are so concerned, we will keep the gates open. Next year, they were planning us to close the gates because there was a flood in Mosul and people were dying. So we tried to tell the Iraqi people that it's not a matter of the quantity of water, it's a matter of the usage, the efficient usage of water. And it is still a point that we haven't reached a common point, a consensus. We are working on it with the Iraqi side, but they started understanding maybe at the political level, but this political level is difficult to reach out to the people and tell them that, sorry guys, it will take 20 or 10 years to build the necessary infrastructure to have a sustainable solution to this water issue. So again and again, I would turn back to the same points. Let's empathize each other. Let's empathize each other. That is the very square one to start building the building and to move on a constructive road. Let me stop here.
Okay, very good. You talk about, of course, difficulties of explaining PKK to the Iraqis. I think we are having the same difficulty of explaining the PKK now. They are American allies in Syria, the connection with the YPG and PKK. That's the difficulty we are having for a long time, I guess, with other states also. With the European states, we are having the same problem sometimes. That shows us the inability of the countries to fight against terrorism together. But let's move to other subjects. Mr. Sadun, I would like to ask you a question about the incoming Iranian administration. It is going to be, it looks like a lot change in Tehran, and Rouhani, Javad administration will go, and probably Raisi administration will come. It is going to have some effects of not on the Iranian policies in Iraq and the Middle East, in your view?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you know that the Iranian policy in the region, there is 2 kinds of the policy, Iranian policy. We have Iran, the revolution, and Iran, the state. And this conflict or this competition between the 2 wings in the Iranian leadership is continuous to affect and impact in the region. Well, the Iranian state tried to establish a new policy in Iraq and in the region in general. In the last protest, Iran spent many years to increase its influence in Iraq, but in the last protest, the protesters burned the Iranian consulate in Karbala and in Basra, and the Iraqi people raised a slogan that our neighbor should be our friend, not our master. I think the state, the wing of the Iran state, realized this fact. But also, I think the Iran revolution, which represents by IRG, maybe he wants to continue in his policy in Iraq and the region. I think the result of this competition or this conflict between the two wings and the Iranian leadership will limit the upcoming or potential change will happen in the Iranian policy in the region. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
What about new administration in Tehran's attitude towards the American? Do you think there will be approachment? It will be easier to proceed with the Iran nuclear deal with the Americans and Iranians, or it is going to be more difficult?
Well, Mr. Chairman, about I mentioned that Iran have a strategy in the region. I will talk about Iraq. The Iranian strategy in Iraq from 2003. It's adopted two strategies. The first is prevent the state in Iraq from collapse, and the other strategy, it's working together. The other strategy shake the situation in Iraq, the security and the economic and the political shaking, continuous shake. This, what we said, this produce for us this chaos in Iraq. It's not clear. The Iranian policy or the Iranian aims, the Iranian goals in Iraq is not clear. It's Iran say, officially say we are stand with the Iraqi stability, with the Iraqi development, but on the ground, we see another thing. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. What about Mr. Menshawi? Do you have anything to add, or should I ask you another question?
I'll just be very quick about the Iranian elections, because apparently that it's going to be won by Raisi, who's a hardliner. So the key element of the checks and balances in Iranian political system is always complicated. That lets for pragmatism to apply. So I believe that the same pragmatic position that is coming with the Iranian nuclear, they would continue because it's in the interest of Iran. And I think that the jury is on, but the rapprochement that we see in the Gulf region between the Saudi Iranians and the Qataris, the Turkish, where there's a sense of reconciliation coming along, perhaps is pushing for this a foreign policy, which is not as hawkish as expected. Perhaps it's more of a hedging between positions as such. This is why I believe, yeah.
Okay, I have been, of course, following the events in the Middle East for a long time. I was ambassador in Israel. I was ambassador before 5 years in Syria. That's why I'm closely following what's happening in Israel also, Mr. Menshawi. My questions to you is, if Mr. Netanyahu loses its prime ministership position, do you think that will affect Israel policies towards other Middle Eastern states, Palestinians? And how do you see, as a foreigner, Egyptian Turkish-Israel relations will develop under the new administration or under the new prime ministership? Because today in the morning, there was some news that first time Mr. Yair Lapid is approaching 61 votes. And one of the Arab Palestinian party, RAM, is being the kingmaker in this thing with 4 deputies, 4 seats in the Israeli parliament, Knesset. How do you think the change of prime ministership in Israel is going to affect its relation with the neighboring Arab states, the Middle East, with Turkey, and the Palestinians? Do you think that will have some positive effect on Palestinian issue?
Thanks so much for the question. I'm not an expert on when it comes to the internal Israeli affairs. However, what I can do is actually take it from the geopolitical regional position, as you kindly asked me the question, how what's really happening inside would affect the outside, the external, if I got you right. I think the first element for what's really happening in Israel right now is the perception that would be built up among the Palestinian side in general and the Hamas in particular of the same sense of victory. If you are living in the Arab region, you would notice that discourse is being constructed among the Palestinians, among the Arabs, that we are winners. Despite the massive destruction that's happening in Gaza, they are believing there's a sense of victories being achieved. And I think this change of politics internally would affect that. This is the number one point. The second element is that Netanyahu built his legitimate position on a sense of a hard line tactic, in which is the more he pounded Hamas in Gaza, the more popularity, the more political survival that he would gain inside Israel. This dynamic is no longer working for one key reason that is actually being inserted in the equation, which is the Palestinians living in Israel, that we call the 1948 Arabs. They are actually acting like a control variable in a way, because these are Israeli citizens after all, who are actually changing the tactic, not only in Jerusalem, but in other areas as well. And if we make reference to security in the sense of externalization and othering, those people have demands. As you mentioned, the Arab bloc is actually making an impact as such. I think all these dynamic, these shifts as quicker, as dynamic, as immutable as they are, they have an impact. The second element of the Israeli-Turkish Egyptian cooperation, I believe there is a sense of rapprochement that will go up if Egypt and Turkey, they push for their relations forward. Perhaps there is a sense of that Israel can get along as well, because we can see the Egyptian prestige or diplomatic presence and aura is being regained in one way or another. Put in mind that the battle between Turkey and Egypt was about exclusion. How the regime of Erdogan can push the Sisi out as an outsider of the political, regional, and international game. What's really happening now, Al-Sisi regime is part of the game of mediation, and he can no longer be taken out, whether you like it or not, sadly, or happily, for different kinds of people standing on the different side. That means actually the Egyptian regime and the Turkish government or the Turkish regime can come along together, in which Israel can be part of it. We can see the Egyptian mediation position would facilitate coming together. The second and perhaps most important element is the economic position. I believe that Egypt, Turkey, and Israel, they are all need for this economic prowess and economic improvement that comes with geography, that comes with the East Mediterranean Forum, if you like. I think that each country is interested in having a stable Eastern Mediterranean region in which they all benefit from this kind of gas spoils in one way or another. So I'm very optimistic that there's a sense of coming together rather than the animosity of the past when it comes to Israel, when it comes to Turkey, and when it comes to Egypt as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Ambassador Güney, do you have anything to add to previous speakers' answers? Or would you like to talk about a little bit more about the Turkish-Israeli-Egyptian cooperation in the Eastern Mediterranean?
That's a very hot topic to comment on, and especially in this chair, I would just believe that it will work in the benefit of both all three countries. There are definitely some differences of opinions, differences of interpretations of interests, geopolitically, geostrategically in the Eastern Mediterranean. But I agree with Mr. Menshawi that there are some, some steps taken, especially between Turkey and Egypt, which might work well. If this process of warming up sustainably moves on further. But as I laid down the main principles of Turkish foreign policy, and it's not only vis-a-vis Syria and Iraq, it's for all the Middle East at large. With regard to Israel, I would say, reacting to Turkey's criticisms as anti-Semitism so far has not helped both countries to develop a very constructive discourse. And I just read an article from Times of Israel written by Abraham Foxman, but he is criticizing the Israeli discourse of depicting each and every criticism as anti-Jewish or anti-Israel. Yes, we do criticize the Israeli policies. It's not being against Jewish people. It's not being against Israeli people. So we should have a more, prudent way to understand the rhetoric of the other side. At the end of the day, the Palestinians, they deserve their own nationhood. Hamas is a kind of a reality on the ground. They do represent a portion of the Palestinian people. In the elections 2006 January, I was in Jerusalem, and they got the votes, and they were not given any chance to govern. So I do also understand the Israeli anxiety and concerns of security. They had their own traumas dating back to 60 years ago, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, and even 100 years ago, pogroms. But, we should start from somewhere. We should start stepping in the right direction. And this has been tried many times, this discourse from the Israeli side, and it didn't work. So why should we repeat the same discourse each and every time? It's a futile effort. With Egypt, I think this exploratory talks, I would assume, started well after a long while. We should understand each other's concerns, and I think that was a step in the right direction. There's a huge potential between Egypt and Turkey. Egypt is 100 million people. Turkey is over 80 million. And Egypt is within this subsystem, has also food in different subsystems, the African subsystem, Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East, and Turkey as well, in the Caucasian, Europe. So each can complement each other. And that would be a very added value for each country if they synergically combine their strength. I would stop here. These are general remarks. I know I don't want to get into details for each and every country because these are all hot potatoes in our hands. I know.
Yes. Anyway, we don't have much time. We have few minutes left, but of course, any country. For Turkey, of course, what's happening around Turkey is very important. And recently, of course, I was in Turkey, seeing that our attentions turned to the Black Sea area recently very much. What's happening in Belarus, what's happening in Ukraine, our relation with Russia, that's very important. And our foreign minister is visiting Greece. Our relations with the United States and the European Union, that are, of course, maybe Ambassador Güney knows very well. He's, of course, much younger than me, but when I entered the foreign ministry, we always heard Turkish foreign policy, a multi-dimensional Turkish foreign policy. And that was very correct because what's happening in Caucasus, what's happening in the Black Sea, and what's happening in the Balkans very much is interest affects our interest, very much affects our interest. And recently, what we have been, of course, seeing Turkish-Russian relations, especially with the Ukrainian president visit to Turkey, is again in the forefront. But we have a few minutes time, and of course, I also served as an ambassador in Syria. Our Arab speakers, I would like to ask them, what is the reason? We talk about the Arab Spring, and I know, of course, Mr. Mashari talk about it as being a process, but after all, we have been seeing a civil war in two Arab states in the Middle East, in Syria and in Yemen and in Libya, probably, even though now things are going much better in Libya. But we are seeing also in Lebanon, in Iraq, there are some disturbances. As a very young diplomat, I serve in Lebanon. I like Lebanon very much. But it is, of course, I understand and I agree with the interpretation that Arab Spring is being a process, and it will take time, of course. But why we have this civil wars and disunity in the Arab world today? May I ask Mr. Mashari to you and Mr. Sadun?
Thanks.
We have only a few minutes, so I would like to, I have to ask you to be short as possible.
Okay, thanks so much for that. I'll be very short. I think there are three elements that we have to put in mind. The first one is the Arab nationalism. The sense that we as Arabs and externals like you, Turkish gentlemen, and a lot of people are watching us, that there's a sense of unity and consolidation between Arabs as if they are one Arab entity. And of course, that is being supported by the history of the Ottoman, the new Turks, all these elements coming together. I think what's really happening in the Arab region now is a sense that Arab nationalism stays discursive, it stays rhetorical, it stays cultural nationalism, national Arabism. There is no on the ground a sense of unity as coming us together. So this is the first element. This is why the disunity between Arabs is as realistic, as natural outcome of the sense of fragmentation in politics in the past decades since the state formation. And the second element, which is really important, is what we can call the sovereignty dilemma in the Arab region. I think there's a sense of the Arab states are not quite sure, is this sovereignty as Westphalian as it could be, where you have very intact borders, in which centralized government is in power and no one is allowed to interfere, or there's a sense of sovereignty in the responsibility to protect sense where a country like Saudi Arabia, a country like Qatar, they have the right to or Turkey, of course, they have the right to interfere into Syrian affairs. I think until this dilemma is sorted out, we will see this kind of confusion and rhetoric. Shall Assad stay in power? Shall Assad leave power? And all these kind of processes coming along. And I think the third element that we have to put in mind is that the sense of what is really happening in the Arab Spring, why it has to be a process, is that it's evolving, it's in dynamic. So probably we cannot fixate it as such in order to have it as the final element that I would have very quickly is the sense of sectarianization which is pervading the Arab region. And this sense of sectarianization by meaning the othering, the externalness. Everybody is accusing the other body of being a traitor, an outsider. And in that sense, you cannot have a kind of a middle ground position in which you can build this sense of this sense of reconciliation, which is happening in Saudi, Qatari, Syrian, Egyptian, and in which coming to all bodies as such. So until this senses of sectarianization, sovereignty, in which Turkey is partly involved with its involvement in Libya, in Syria, in Qatar as well, until this sense of sovereignty is being settled down, we will have all these kind of tension keeps coming up in one way or another.
Thank you very much. We are coming to the end of our program, but I would like to ask Ambassador Güney if he has anything to add. Yes, please.
I just thank you, His Excellency, for your, both thought-provoking and incentivizing questions. And it's almost an impossible task to have a crystal ball about Middle East. It's almost impossible to specifically address each and every questions that you posed. But we hope, as we are from different countries, that we would find a peaceful way to solve our problems and reconciliation at the end of the day. Thank you.
Okay, very good. I think we have completed our time. I would like to thank three distinguished speakers for their speeches, for their answers, to make us understand a little bit more intimately the Middle East, because I spent most of my career, in the second half of my career, in the Middle East area. I was posted in many Middle Eastern countries, and I was Director General of the Middle East. I travel extensively, so I still try to keep, my facts correct. Especially, I am interested with Syria and Israel, of course, because that is the two countries I serve. But I thank you, three of you. Really, it was very beneficial for me to listen to you. Thank you very much. Good night.
We thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.